So with all the admin out of the way, I would like to introduce our wonderful guests, Sebastian Major and Daniele Bolelli, who are going to join me for a discussion about history and storytelling. Now, gentlemen, both of your podcasts are focused on the compelling stories in history, the true, the fake, the bizarre, and as we know, the stories that are so good they simply must be told. So, how does a collection of historical facts become a story? And how is that story then transformed into a history podcast?
Take it away, Daniele.
Sound good. Thank you for having us, by the way. So to me, that's the key to what we do as podcasters. I think I can speak for Sebastian as well, as far as this is very much at the roots of what we do, is the idea that, okay, let me backtrack. If you read any history textbooks are by definition boring. They are not, but even not the textbook, even most history books written by good historians, they are fantastic because they offer you a ton of good information. You get the sources, you find the real story, you do all that. But are they enjoyable to read? Enjoyable is a subjective thing, but generally speaking, they are not the thing I can't wait to get to the next chapter on a Saturday night,
Mm-hmm.
Like half of the time when I'm doing research for a podcast, I'm thinking, why am I doing this? Because I'm reading one bland, tedious book after another. Occasionally, there's a good writer. That tends to be the exception to the rule. So most of the time, the way I see it is, as podcasters who are going through massive amount of research and data and information to kind of dig out all the little gold nuggets, but then the job of putting it together in a story that somebody who's not a captive audience actually would want to hear, that's a whole different game. And I think that's in some way, the fact that so many historians are terrible writers is why we have a job. Because if they could tell great stories, then we would be out of luck, because they would be the great researchers and the great storytellers. As it stands, they are primarily great researchers, not so good at putting together a narrative. And so to answer your question, I think one of the key elements is put yourself in your audience shoes. If I'm not a student in a classroom where I don't have a way out, I am a captive audience. Like if I'm not in a situation where I'm a captive audience, what would hold my attention? So of course, you need to mix, you need to tell a powerful story with great characters. You need to make it compelling. You need to break the rhythm. You need to be able to essentially grab somebody who may not care the least about history and hook with what is that you care about. Well, you can find it in history. You can find it in this story. You care about love, sex, war, passion, intense characters. Here they are. And then I think that's what helps craft a story. But primarily, I always find character-driven things are easier to do than just big picture stuff.
Right, for sure. What about you, Sebastian?
Yeah, man, I completely agree with what Daniele was saying. Yeah, part of, I think, what kind of drove me to the career I'm doing now, holy crap, guys, my podcast, my career, is I started as someone who did their master's in history. I'm sure a lot of people here are people that studied history at the university level, and I did my master's in something called public history with the thought that I was going to work in museums. And I found that I had an internship working for a curator here in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. There's a lot of museums here. And that's what I thought my life was going to be. I'm going to be a museum guy in Canada's capital city. But I found that I actually hated the research. I've since got more of a love for it, actually crafting stories out of it. But at the time, like, I had a job for him where I had to go to the National Archives of Canada and like sort through stuff to like pick out, the nuggets of it all. And so that raw data is essential, because that's how we know things are true, right? So like, you have to be able to, like, again, as Daniele is saying, like, God bless them for doing that, because that's how we can actually say that a thing happened or that it was documented in some way. But that's like, I always hated that part of it. And some people that pursue history to become history professors or pursue it at that level, that's what they love. They love the hunt, right? They're into that. And I kind of pursued education because I was like, I just want to talk about it. I want to make it engaging. But I mean, so I guess I agree with Daniele that the collection of those sort of facts is essential, but like it even bored me as a person that loves history. And so how do you then make that into narrative? Well, first you kind of have to take your cues from the historians that actually are good writers, right? And okay, I'll give you a quick example of a historian that I think evolved from one type of like historian into a historian that I kind of want to model my own thing after. Canadian historian named Alan Greer. And in the 70s, Alan Greer was very much in the school of social history. And he wrote a really in-depth history about New France, right? So what is now Quebec and New Brunswick, basically colonial France in North America. And it was like a very detailed economic history. It was called like merchant farmer peasant or something like that. Merchant farmer priest. Yeah, merchant farmer priest, right? So it's like, here are the essential New France archetypes, and like documents after documents on like, harvests and like how much food was coming in and how that related to how the church functioned. And it was like, it again, the most thorough thing you could ever read about New France, but fucking boring. I don't know if I'm sorry. I'm not allowed to swear. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine.
But watching Alan Greer evolve, so around the 2000s, he wrote a history book that I love called Mohawk Saint. And it's about this one woman who's indigenous Mohawk woman who was eventually canonized by the Catholic Church. And it's the story of like her life and the life of the Jesuit who eventually like put her up for canonization, who allegedly witnessed all her miracles. And still a very serious piece of academic history, but my God, was it fun. It was full of flourishes. It was full of narrative. It was full of like really sort of just great reading. And it was like, oh, look at the evolution of this, a truly responsible, excellent historian who has now embraced levels of narrative. And there's a way to sort of tip your audience that like, hey, look, I'm doing a thing, check it out. Like I'm making a move here while still being responsible to the facts of the story. So he's someone that I think about a lot when I'm creating the things that I create.
So it's this idea of hooks again, because we have these ideas of the character-driven stuff, the character-driven aspect of history, or the big moments of sex or war or violence or miracles or things that seem unbelievable. How do we negotiate this aspect that gives history its most human impact?
I think it's important to be honest if we're doing history. Again, if we're doing fiction, that's a different story. If we're doing the Hollywood version, then all bets are off. You're free to make up whatever you want. I'm a big fan of the whole Tarantino, Brad Pitt kill Hitler in World War II. And like, make up anything you want. That's fiction. It's understood that's not the reality. But if you're presenting something as history, well, then you need to be honest about it. You need to be just as accurate as the full-blown historian with note-taking everything. However, doesn't mean you can tell a good story. So, for example, in many cases, when it comes to there's a great tale, but the evidence for it is kind of sketchy, maybe Sebastian's wheelhouse, maybe a historical myth, I will present it as, hey, this is what many people believed. Probably didn't happen, and here is why. I'm not 100% sure because I wasn't there, but the evidence doesn't seem to go to support that this really happened. However, feel free to believe whatever you want. I'm just telling you, here is the evidence that we have for some. And sometimes it's a little trickier. Sometimes you have 2 or 3 versions of something that happened. None of them is conclusively, clearly the truth. They
Mhm.
all have a little bit of evidence. And I often play very hands off as my conclusion. Unless I'm really sold on one, then I'll present it. It's like, this is what some people believe, and this is why.
Mhm.
Convincing to a point, but not fully. And this is what other people believe and why. And essentially, you just put it all in the hands of the listeners, saying, this is, now you have the exact same of information that I have on this, and do what you will with it. And I think
Right.
that balance between telling a story while being honest is key to what we do. Because without the entertainment, we're back to writing like the boring historical textbook. And without the accuracy, we're just going into straight fiction.
Mhm.
Right on. And one thing sometimes I find a little frustrating when I'm hunting for hooks for my podcast are historians that are like, well, we all know that Billy the Kid is a legend. And I'm like, tell me the legend. Like, where is it? And actually, something I love about Daniele's podcast, like, I mean, Daniele, going back to your very first podcast on Spartacus, right?
Mhm.
I remember I loved that. Right away, I was like, oh, I think I'm gonna like this guy. But like, you were like, it's not like I'm not gonna tell you about the preposterous mountains of bodies on the on the field, right? And it's like it strains credulity, but like that's the juice, right? And there is a responsible way to be like, I know this story is bonkers bananas. But like, how could I not tell you about it?
Mhm.
And I do find that some, responsible histories are just like, well, we wash our hands. Like I won't even mention it because it's for fear that it kind of muddies the sort of objectivity of their research or something like that. But I mean, that is actually one of the perks of doing what we do, right? Where we can be a little more juicy with it, and that's not to say we get to be more irresponsible, but I think we can privilege a little bit more. Like, I'm going to tell you this wild thing. Man, this research I'm doing right now is Daniele. It's about your home state. It's about the history of California, and it's about a couple of figures who may have been the inspiration for Zorro. And one of them is Joaquin Murrieta, and so what's fascinating there is that like the primary sources on that guy are like shreds, like so little that it may not have even been one person. It may be like 5 guys named Joaquin. But the definitive source that like everyone uses was essentially a historical novel that was written about him in the like 1850s. And so like that's the primary, well, it's not a primary text, but that is the text you have to go to. So to tell that story, you essentially got to go like, this is the legend as recorded by this guy, and we can't even truly verify it. But if we don't use that, then this person might as well didn't exist, right? And so how do you do that? Well, I mean, and I think Daniele and I are so aligned in this that it's like, you got to tell the tale with the caveats, right? This maybe didn't happen here. There's nothing to support this. However, here's this awesome story about like this man jumping up on a saloon and throwing open his vest and going, I am Joaquin, shoot if you will shoot, that's awesome. We're not going to tell you about that.
Exactly. These are the stories people want to hear. So we're balancing this approach between the perks of being able to tell the most amazing and ridiculous stories with the responsibility of being honest and accurate. So let's bring in the other side of that. What are the pitfalls of narrative history and storytelling?
I mean,
go ahead, Sebastian.
I'll start, and I promise I won't blab on too long, but like, I know when creating the podcast, even in a show where I'm like busting historical myths, you want closure sometimes. And you kind of gravitate to it as a writer when you're constructing it. And so sometimes you're like, oh, you have to stop yourself from gravitating to some easy closure for your story. And it's always better when you don't. Like, it's always better when you pause and you go like, oh, actually this ends ambiguously, and like, how like life, like that's actually better. But there is an urge to
unsatisfying.
Right. And it's because I think we understand things through narrative, right?
Mhm.
Like all understanding comes through telling a story. And so sometimes there's, when you want something to be clear, when you're communicating it, you're like, there's sometimes an urge to be like, this is how it ended up. But even though it's like, I don't actually fully know that. There's a lot of times when I actually stop myself when I'm writing, where I've written something and then I have to go, wait, I actually don't know that thing as well as I want to know. I think I know it. And then you got to go back to your sources and make sure that it's right. And if it's not, I think it's important to let it be ambiguous, but you got to stop yourself. And I've had to stop myself before too. And it's because there's nothing more embarrassing when you're like, I'm a myth buster, and people are like, you're out there perpetuating this stuff, man. So
Yeah, I agree 100%. I'm big on leaving, unless I'm 100% sold on a conclusion. I don't need to have a hard conclusion where I feel that I need to establish what the truth is. Because in most cases, well, maybe not most, but in many cases, it's not that clear. You know, I give you examples. I did a whole long series about Joan of Arc. And in her case, I'm unsatisfied with any conclusion. Oh, yeah, Sebastian did that too. Actually, that's where I got the inspiration.
And we're coming up on it too.
oh yeah.
I heard him doing it, and he did such a phenomenal job that I was like, oh, I like this story, but you know, he said everything. And then I'm like, oh, I can go in slightly different route and play with it. So,
yeah.
But yeah, you look at a story like that, and you have all the people who dismiss all the miracles, and they have to dismiss most of the evidence about her life. And, you know, either you say they all made stuff up, or if any of that stuff is true, it's very hard to explain.
Right.
The people who instead tend to be, you know, the miracle, God speak to her, never mind that there are a few issues with that on a plain level, but also there are other cases where it doesn't work, where she gets things wrong, where she while of a set. So, you know, basically anybody to reach a firm conclusion have to desperately shove some pieces of evidence that fit with a whole bunch that doesn't, and that's how they get their conclusion. I got the same thing when I did this one episode on the beast of Gévaudan, this animal that killed a whole bunch of peasants in 1700s France. And everybody's like, oh, clearly it was this giant wolf. No, clearly it was a lion that escaped a zoo. No, clearly. And it's like, no, clearly nothing, because all the pieces of evidence, there's this much that support your conclusion, and there are 5 things that don't. And so to me, it's like, it speaks volumes about the human desire to come up with some kind of clarity. Yeah. And I don't think we do it just in narrative history. I think this is at the roots of most terrible ideas that we have politically, philosophically, and in every other way, is that we take something, a partial truth, where you're absolutely right when you take it from ear to ear, and you stretch it way beyond what it's warranted, to a place where it becomes a dogma, it becomes actually a terrible idea. And I think, you know, what we do in narrative history is just a subset of this greater human desire to have firm, solid, strong conclusions about everything. Despite the fact that we live in a universe where we don't know most of anything that happens. You know, it's like, you know, all the big questions in life, we have no idea. And so being human becomes having to become comfortable living with the mystery. And I don't think most people are.
And I think that's, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, sure. Bree, please.
I was going to say, I think that's a perfect example of what I see as the major risk of storytelling, which is the risk of oversimplifying complex human experiences, and the potential of these myths becoming exploitative or trivializing real human experiences. So it's a matter of really having to negotiate how you're going to do that with respect to the fact that these are all real people and these are all real experiences that are far more complex than we can understand.
This was something that actually came up a lot in the series I just did. So I just did a 3-parter on the Salem witch trials. And the stuff that I read about them that I loved were people that embraced the chaos of the event, right? Because it's 17 things happening at once, truly. And what's kind of fun is to kind of like, okay, let's pick out each sort of thread and be like, here's how it all is kind of baking together here. But what is the stuff that I got really suspicious of were the people are like, we can explain the Salem witch trials by blank, right? Like the Salem witch trials, you know what it was? Ergot poisoning. That's it. They all ate the bread, and that explains everything. It's like, well, even if, and oh, by the way, ergot sucks, everyone. It turns out ergot is the least satisfying explanation for any strange historical event. Luke there, it's always ergot. Yeah, I know, right? But even if, let's say, you know, some of these girls in Salem at that time ate bread that had ergot and had hallucinations, that explains like a sliver of that event, like a tiny sliver of it. There's so much else that needed to happen to leave all those people dead, to have all those people accused, to turn it into the full-on crisis that it was. And so, yeah, like, I mean, when I'm doing my research, I find that if I have a bias, it's I like it when people are like, embrace the complexity. Here's all the stuff. And like, you know, don't be afraid of it. But those stories are also the hardest to turn into narratives, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you tell that story responsibly by embracing the complexity? And at a certain point with that story, I'm like, okay, what we are doing is like charting a meteorological event here, right? Like this is like describing like how a hurricane or a tornado got started. Here are the climactic conditions that make it possible. And then like, here's a path that was sort of suggested for it. And then it just sort of swirled around, you know, and got crazy. And so, but there is like a real desire when you're writing and creating these shows to be like, oh God, I've got to zone in on something here. I've got to narrow it down to make this legible. And that was my greatest challenge with that particular series. And there were things that I wasn't able to mention. There were other, you know, theories and takes or stuff that I was only able to scratch the surface of, just, you know, by basis of my own self-imposed time constraints on it. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's an example of like really trying to get the balance right. And,
yeah,
you know, hopefully, and all you can do is your best, right? And just try and kind of keep the North Star of like, humanity is wild, and you know, don't discount that, you know.
for sure. Is there anything you want to add to that, Daniele?
No, I think it makes perfect sense. I think it's the challenge that we have. But honestly, I don't think it's that bad of a challenge unless we are dogmatically inclined to feel the need to be very black and white in our thinking. I think you can tell great stories, and you can allow for nuance, allow for mystery, allow for the fact that, hey, I'm just taking you as far as I can honestly take you. This is the evidence. I cannot make it be more than it is. And actually it would be dishonest to try to go further than what I'm showing you. And you know, I actually enjoy that because it seemed like such a simple concept, and yet I don't see it that often. And more often than not, on any level, again, in history, in philosophy, in politics, I find a great premise based on good evidence and stretching it too far. And so I enjoy reminding people we don't need to stretch it that far. We can stop where we have evidence. We can stop where we are sure. We can stop there and not force it.
And that's a perfect springboard for this next question. So I will say we are at 15 minutes left. So if you have questions and you are in the chat, please start throwing them in, and I'm going to start throwing them in with mine. Luke asks, and this is perfect following what you just said, how do we define where that border between storytelling in history and historical fiction is? And I'd like you to start with this one, Daniele, since you are, in fact, doing exactly that.
Yeah, I enjoy both languages. You know, if I'm doing narrative history, the emphasis is on both sides. You know, but primarily it's history, right? If I'm presenting it as these are real facts, I'm not going to tweak them. Again, I can present what the legends are, but I'm going to just do everything very kind of fact-checking everything, using all the reference, being evidence-based. And then I can try to tell it in a way that's engaging.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm doing something like historical fiction, which, as you mentioned, is something I've been working quite a bit. I finished a book a few months ago about the life of Caravaggio, the Italian painter, was also kind of a gangster and a wild character.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I did 2 episodes of the podcast on Caravaggio, but in those, I stick strictly to the evidence. When I switch to historical fiction, I'm not trying to present the historical Caravaggio. It's based on the historical Caravaggio, but the end result will be my Caravaggio, right? It's going to be some, because I'm adding things. You know, for example, Caravaggio was so weird and intense and kind of violent and disturbed. Why? The evidence doesn't tell us. We don't know why. There's just no way to know. So I make up a story in historical fiction where I give him a backstory. It's completely made up. It's plausible in, like many other things could be plausible, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination real. And I don't want people to think it's real. It's like I'm taking you on a journey with me where we mix, we start from history and then we make up cool stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as long as one is honest about what we are doing, if somebody tell me, oh, but that didn't happen, that is like, yeah, that's what the podcast is for. You want to know about the real historical Caravaggio? Here is everything I've done on that.
Right.
This, we are taking a fantasy journey, a fun journey, and it's the end result, it becomes something else. And I think it's because when it comes to historical fiction, there are many different kinds. You know, there are some where they are almost fully historical, but they fictionalize things by just adding dialogue based on the evidence. So they are mostly, they don't make up anything other than spicing it up a little. Others are, you know, Inglorious Bastards, Tarantino, where you just make up stuff wildly that has nothing, you know, you start from a grain of history and then you go off in a radically different direction. And then there's all sort of stuff somewhere in between. I think it's good to be clear on what the expectations are. You know, I do plan on the book to put a quick preface, say that you want the history, here is where you go to find the history. If you stick with me here, this is me making up stuff based on history. And again, let's be clear that these are 2 very different tracks.
Yes. So as I throw this question to you, Sebastian, I'm going to add an element here. If you were to write a historical fiction, what would you choose?
Oh, yeah, if I was to write, God, yeah, there's certain times and places that I like to go in my imagination. And so like, I kind of totally get why Daniele gravitated to Caravaggio and that.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Right.
My
and also
gateway drug.
Yeah. Right. And also just that, because that time and place, like Italy at that particular time is what a cool place to just play, you know? So when I think of stuff like that, you know what, when I did the series on who was the people to invent the first airplane, right? The debate around who did the first airplane. I kind of fell in love with Alberto Santos Dumont, and like his sort of wild life in Paris. Like that turn of the century Paris is kind of fun, and like the idea of like just being super into ballooning in turn of the century Paris. And you know, something that I didn't really get into in that is that like there's reason to believe, and it's not like hard and fast, that he was probably gay. And so again, in a historical fiction, you can really explore that. Be like, I'm going to take where there's this like shred of evidence here, and I'm going to imagine what this guy's swinging life in Paris could have been. So that always comes to mind. I know Daniele and I both love the conquest of Mexico as a story. I brought it up in my talk. If anyone was in the keynote I just did, I mean, yeah, like I can't help but go back to that story again and again, because I really am fascinated by it as just maybe the wildest thing that's ever happened in the past. And so, you know, I like, especially this moment when the conquistadors get to Tenochtitlan and they kind of take Montezuma hostage. But it's like he's kind of half their hostage, and they're kind of keeping up the pretense that like he's not their hostage. And him and Cortez apparently, according to some sources, develop sort of a relationship, and they play games together, and they go on like pleasure cruises together, and they like get to know each other in this like weird dynamic. And I've always thought like that would be a fun thing to explore, just like 5 weeks in Tenochtitlan, me and Montezuma hanging. And then but until it turns, right, until it's like, oh no, the people of the city have turned on us, and then it's this wild escape from the city, right? So those are just times that I like to go in my imagination. And again, you just get these little kernels there that would be fun to explore through fiction. But again, before I pass it on, one thing that comes off a lot of times in my research is we're talking about the border between historical fiction and proper history, or traditional history, let's call it, is that sometimes you have to use fictionalized sources, like especially if you're doing stuff about the ancient past. Like Tacitus, the great Roman historian Tacitus, is kind of a fiction writer at times, right? And so when you're using those ancient sources, like these guys like talk about inventing dialogue, they'll invent like entire speeches that people gave on the battlefield. And so, like the further back you go, and especially Roman history, like essentially you are seeing it through the prism, unless you're doing archaeology, of course, but you're reading those sources, you're seeing it through the prism of a type of historical fiction. So, and that's fun. It's wild. It's weird. And there's like, what do you believe? It's hard to say. But the responsible thing is read as much as you can. Are there differing sources? Is archaeology telling us a different tale? And the more you have, the more sort of thoughtful your ultimate approach can be.
Right.
I love that you want to do a buddy comedy that ends in murder. That sound,
aren't those the best kinds?
They are.
So
yeah,
Robert has a question for Danielle, I think more directed at Daniele here, which is, how do you make it crystal clear the distinction between verifiable history and the historical fiction if you are the author of both about the same character?
I think that's what intros are for. You make it very clear what you're doing. Is like, this is fiction based on history, but it's fiction. So if you want actual history, here is where you go. And right. And also, you clarify the line. If I'm doing History on Fire, that's just straight up history. There's no fiction involved there. If I'm writing a novel, by definition, that's fiction. And so I just feel like 3 lines at the beginning, or a quick speech at the beginning of a podcast, just clarifying the expectations, what we are doing, because those are 2 very different hats that you put on. It's like, is a historian hat on, now it's fiction hat based on history, which is a whole different thing. Right. And I see also that, let me see, there was a question about this.
Are you referring to Eric's questions?
Eric's question about whether the a movie based on true events makes up stuff, because of course based on true events is not true events. Otherwise, you'd never be doing a documentary, right? I think when it comes to movies, I don't know where people get the idea that somehow that's history. Again, it's not. It's based on history. They are not history. If you go into a movie thinking that you're gonna see history, you're going with the wrong expectation, because that's not what the medium is for. It's and so in that regard, it's anything that you're doing that is not a documentary and is not a straight historical textbook, that is entertainment. And as such, it may be loosely, and again, some people are much more loose than others with it. Take like my all-time favorite thing when it comes to historical fiction is the HBO TV series Rome.
Yes.
So that was just a masterpiece in every possible way. It's the 2 main characters are made up, which, by the way, that's a great way to get into a time period. Is that way you're not making up something about a character that's real, you're making up something fictional, plausible characters.
Adjacent.
Yeah, exactly. But even the lives of the big guys, the Augustus and Caesar and these, they are heavily fictionalized. because it's a movie, because that's the nature of that's what we do if you want to tell a good story in a movie. And, so often if you're going to tell somebody's life and you're missing pieces, well, you can't in a movie. And so you do need to fill in the blanks with stuff that you make up or you spice up the story. And again, I think we should be clear that unless it's a documentary, I'm not expecting accurate history there. I'm expecting a good story. I'm expecting to be entertained. I'm not expecting to be educated. Educated is what the books and the documentaries are for.
Right. So we are in our last 3 minutes. So let's do final wrap-up thoughts. How do we want to wrap this up, our journey through narrative and storytelling?
Final thoughts. It's, what, as I've gone on doing this podcast for 8 years, almost 9 years, it's become the thing I've become most obsessed with. And I love good stories. I love good stories. And that's always what I gravitate to. And I also have, like, I am someone who, as I was saying before, has to, like, check my love of the story sometimes. And so I know Daniele and I both try to have our cake and eat it too. And so I guess it's up to you folks listening if we're doing a good job of it.
Final thoughts, Daniele?
No, I think we all laid it down. I just want to say I'm very thankful this was fun, and I enjoy particularly anytime, Sebastian is on a very short list of my favorite podcasters. So I love anytime I get to chat with him and toss ideas with him and compare notes. I feel we have a very similar taste for the kind of stories we're attracted to. And then we take them in a bit different directions while still respecting the evidence. So there's still enough variety that we can cover the same story and it's going to be a different experience. But we clearly have, I know why you like this story. It's the same reason I like the story.
And Daniele, the feeling is so mutual. I love your work. I love you. I think you're just a beautiful man. But no, but
love all around.
I truly love the work you do. And I'm it's getting to know you through this weird world of podcasting has been sort of one of the great gifts. And by the way, Brie, Pontifex also rules. And I think love to Pontifex. I think you and Fry very quickly established a great dynamic on that show, and it's one that I go to a lot as well. So thank you for moderating.
Thank you for being here. And with that, we have 20 seconds to wrap up. So thank you again to our wonderful panelists, Daniele and Sebastian. It's been my pleasure. Thank you for being a part of Intelligent Speech. And we'll see you all who are here at the next panel. Bye, guys.
Cheers. Thanks.